Hey mate, what would you do if I raped you?
Wow, I was 18. I was up at King's Cross, the red light district of Sydney. Marion and I had just got into a conversation with a man who was keen to know about Jesus when all of a sudden this drunk guy breaks into our group and at the top of his lungs yells out,
What would you do if I raped you?
Oh, move on, mate.
It seemed that whenever Marion and I got into a conversation with someone who wanted to know more about Jesus, some interruption would happen. But the little drunk man did not move on. Instead, he stood between the man we were speaking to and me and again yelled, even louder.
I said, what would you do if I raped you?
Put even a finger on me and I'll hit you so hard you become part of the pavement.
Well, what would you have done?
Oh, okay.
And so he went. But the interruption ended the conversation with the man we had been speaking to. He quickly moved away. As we were driving home that night, I told the story of our encounter with the little drunk man to Alec, the leader of our band. I must admit that at this point of time, I was pretty happy with my response. It was decisive, it was strong, and it was effective. But I could see that Alec was not happy with my response. How did your response demonstrate God's love?
Oh, come on, Alec. What was I supposed to do? He was abusive, he was threatening, he was rude, he was under the influence. I certainly wasn't going to say, sure, do your worst.
But how did your response demonstrate God's love?
Well, how do you think I should have responded?
I was 18 back then, and almost half a century has passed since that incident. And in that half a century, there have been many times when I have been under attack, when I've had to deal with abusive, threatening and rude people, and people under the influence. But I have to admit that when it happens now, one of the first things I ask myself is how can I respond in a way that demonstrates the love of God? With the benefit of hindsight and the maturity that one gains over a half a century, I realised my response back then, well, it was the wrong response. I simply responded to that drunken man's threat with a threat of my own.
Put even a finger on me and I'll hit you so hard you become part of the pavement.
The Bible says a gentle response diffuses anger. It would have been better for me to say,
Hey, I see you're kind of intoxicated, but you got a few questions. So let's come over here and talk about it.
Would it have worked? Well, who knows? But maybe it would have been a better demonstration of God's love than my counter threat. When I told this story to my kids, they agreed that it was an embarrassing encounter, and they wondered, like I did, what would have been a better response. The world tells us to respond in a way that is decisive, strong, and effective. But Jesus tells us to respond in a way that demonstrates his love. Jesus was once interrupted while speaking to some people by a mob who brought with them a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They asked Jesus,
The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?
Now in that day the answer was obvious. The law clearly said that she should be stoned. If he had said, yes, stone her, in accordance with the law, it would have been a decisive, strong and effective response. But while they were demanding an answer from him, Jesus stooped down, drew in the sand, and after some time stood up and said,
All right, but let the person who has never sinned cast the first stone.
No one was prepared to be the person to say they had never sinned. So eventually the mob dispersed, and Jesus turned to the woman and said,
Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?
No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said,
Neither do I. Go and sin no more.
Jesus' response demonstrated God's love. Jesus demonstrated his love to you and me in the same way. The Bible says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." And he wants you and me to, like him, demonstrate that same love to others. Have you experienced this love that I've been talking about? A love that does not want to condemn, but to save. If you want to know more, give us a hoy in the comments. God bless, and see you in the next story.